Hello guys, and welcome to another unhinged GT Codeigniter 4 tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to look at basically database management. So we're going to look at migrations, database creation, migrations, and seeding. Alright. So what I will do, I will start by already have my XAMPP server running. So what I will do, I will start by opening up the sample project that we're working on. I already have it open in my IDE here. I have it open in my IDE. So we're going to be opening it up. Right click on it and click on services, new terminal at folder, or you can navigate if you're in a Windows platform, excuse me. You can navigate to C, XAMPP, htdocs, where you set your folder and open a command window there. So that when, of course, my XAMPP server is running and MySQL server also is running. So I'm going to say PHP Spark serve, which should start the server on localhost port 8080. And when I load this, you should be able to see what we had last time, which is essentially the Codeigniter 4 interface. I am going to open another window, but this time it's going to be simply localhost. And I will click on the far right. So this should open up the localhost dashboard. On the far right, I should be able to see phpMyAdmin. When I click on it, we're going to create a new database. So we'll be given a listing of databases. We're going to create a new database. And in this case, I'm going to simply call it sample. All right, so I'll just simply call it sample with nothing else in it. So we're going to define our tables based on migrations, and we're going to initialize some seeded data based on seeding. Now, we need to first set up the project for database connection. So if you recall, our project had a number of folders. So our first folder was the app, then we had public, we had system. Depending on how you install it, then you might have vendor or system, whichever is applicable in your case. I'm simply going to close these three tabs because I'm not going to use it. Now inside here we have the .env, which stands for environment files, and we have the scaffolding file, which we use to create the .env. So if you don't have it, just right click on it and rename it to .env, which should essentially give you the same file. But since I have .env here, I'm going to look at the database side, and I'm going to have in the default database side, I'm going to have to uncomment out the first 5 lines. So the host name, the database, the user, the password, and the DB driver. Then I'm going to give it my the new names. Yeah. So in this case, I have the database. I'm going to call it sample. This being a local development server, I don't have a password for my database. But if you have a password, then you can give the password name there. All right. Then everything else should remain the same. So if your username is root, or if you have a different username, then you give the different username. If you have a different driver, then maybe MySQL, then you give that database driver a different database driver name. Yeah. Now, if your database starts, so let's say you're hosting it on a hosting platform somewhere, and it starts with maybe your username underscore something, then you will use a DB prefix so that it prefixes your DB names. Yeah. But in our case, since we are using the local environment, then that works. If you have a testing server somewhere, then you can again fill in the details as required here, and then you can fill in the data. Now I'm going back to my folder, and again, because my command window is already running and I don't want to interfere with it without stopping the server, so I will open another command window or another terminal window in the same folder, and we want to see the options that Spark, the server Spark has for us. So here I'll say PHP Spark, which will give us a list of commands that the Spark environment has. We're interested in a number of them. One of them is this migration. Of course, they've modified it. So make migration. So we're interested in this make migration. and of course make seeder, because we want to make a migration file. A migration file is simply an SQL file that contains the create table commands that you use to create your tables. So if you are having the same, if you want to have the same database structure on, or a set of tables that you want to set online, if you move to a new installation, then you can simply say migrate without having to go and run the SQL create table commands multiple times. So we'll use migrations, and then of course, if you want to create default values for some tables, so for example roles, we know that we have some default role tables that the system must go with them. The same applies maybe to a default user, then you will use seeders. In our case, we're going to be using the role table to show the migration. So what I will type here is PHP Spark make, and you can see here we have the make migration command, which allows us to create a file that will contain our migration, so a file that will define our SQL content. So I will say make migration, and I'm going to create migration for the role. So I'm going to create a migration for the table role. So when I type that, migrations are normally defined inside the database migration folder, and it will have the timestamp for the date in which it was created with the file name itself. So once given that I have already created the migration, we have other additional functions that we can do with migration. So again, when you're migrating, you can either refresh, you can roll back, you can get the status of whether a migration has been created or not. And the way it does it is that it keeps track of all the table that has been migrated as a new table, and we'll see that shortly. Going back to our app folder, you can see inside the app folder, you will see database. Inside database, you will have migrations, and you will have a new file containing starting with the dates, and you will have the name of the file. Now this file will extend the Codeigniter migration class, and it will have two functions, up and down. So up function is used to define the setup of the file, and then down function is used to remove. So if you are doing a refresh migration or you want to roll back the migration, then you can use the down function to do that. Now we will be defining a number of fields. So our role table will have a number of fields. The role ID, which is going to be a primary key, role name and a role description, and of course a role status. So just to define this, of course it is always good to give a created date and related date, but then in our case we don't want to give that because we don't want to have because these are essentially created initially with the system, then there's no real need for that. All right. Now, as you can see, there's already an auto-completed file for me. I will be modifying it. This is being done by GitHub Pilot, which automatically, it's an AI-powered code generator for you. So I'll just press tab to get that. So I will have the role ID, which is of type integer. It's going to be auto-incremented, and we're going to give it as that. So we're going to leave it as auto-incremented. We'll leave it as unsigned. We have the role name. The type is going to be variable character. And by the way, just to note that this command here, this description here, is what GitHub Pilot used to generate this content here. So we have the role name, which is a variable character. The name should not be too long, so I want something maybe 20. The role description, again, I want it to be a variable character, and I want it to have a constraint of 100. So yeah, for role character, then that should be fine. I'm just going to constrain. Don't like hanging semicolons. So I want to have the role status, which is of type integer. So maybe defining whether the role is active or not active. So I can, for example, if I want to deactivate all administrators, then I can simply change that active or not active state. Now, I am going to also create or mark two elements as a primary key. So I'm marking the add key as a primary key. Of course, we've already had it as auto incremented. So I'm just going to say add key, this forge add key. I have the role ID and I say true. So this essentially, actually add primary key, not add key, add primary key, which essentially marks it as a primary key. Add key simply marks it as a key in the, if you want to do quick searches, then you mark it as a key. All right. Then I'm going to create a table. So my naming convention is normally TBL, then the name of the table. Okay, so the name of the table is going to be in plural because you're going to have multiple roles stored in that table. Then we're going to create the table. So if you have a view, then you can say VWL roles. So my naming convention just allows for that. Then this is all there is to do with adding a new migration. If you want to drop that table, then we'll say this forge drop table, and we're going to drop the table that we've just created here. So when you're doing a rollback or a remigration, then this is going to allow us. Now, I'm just going to back to my terminal window, and I'm going to say PHP Spark, and I'm going to call migrate. All right. Now, what you notice is that it is going to run the migration, and you should be able to see that it has a status running all new migrations. And if I go to my database window and reload this sample database, you'll notice that we have two tables. So we have the migrations table that contains the file that we migrated, and we will have the roles table that we've just defined. And if you look at the structure, you will see that we have role ID being auto-incremented. It's an integer, role name being a variable character, role description being a variable character, and role status being an integer. In fact, we can make sure that the role status is has a default value, because we always want to have any status being a 0 by default. So I will add the default, and maybe let's add a key, because we'll be using the role. It won't really make much of a difference, but we want to have the role name as a key, right? Now, what we will do is we're going to migrate, but in this case, we're going to add another migrate. Then we're going to add another flag for refresh, which will allow us to have, let me just zoom in, sorry for that, which will allow us to have a new remigration. So if I run the refresh, we're calling the right function, migrate refresh. Yes, so I think it should have migrated successfully. Let's see. What is the error that is giving? We don't have another migration that we've run. Okay, so let's try the rollback command. So we have the first batch. Okay, it's not picking it. So we can actually just simply flag it as, so we can simply just flag the migrations. So we can simply delete this migrations table, and if we run it, it should give us, yeah, there seems to be an error. role name. It's trying to add role name as a primary key. Sorry. Yeah, that's why it was giving errors. Create table. Let's see. PHP Spark. Let's see, cache clear, serve DB, serve rollback, generate, exceeder, migrate, create, migration, that's fine. Yes, so yeah, so I should have used the rollback first, because ideally that would have cleared the database. But since I've cleared this table, we can just truncate all the tables. So we can just delete all the tables for now, so that we start again afresh. Spark migrate, yeah, which should run the migration again successfully, and this will allow us to see, if you look at the roles table, you can see that this has the right data. So if I run migrate rollback called undefined role forge, let me see. Sorry. Yeah, I was calling a method instead of this forge like this. Yeah, that's why it was giving errors. So if I do rollback, then you'll notice that in the database, our table does not exist anymore because it has been rolled back. And you can see in the migrations, we don't have any data. So yeah, so when we migrate, we simply have the data, and that is it. Now, just to quickly move on to the next part, which is on seeding. The seeders, when you're working with seeders, we will again use a command to create the seeder. So we'll say php artisan make, not artisan, sorry, php spark. Artisan was for Laravel. So just want to get the commands again. Now you notice that we have make seeder, right? So we'll say php spark make seeder, and we will give the name of the seeder we want to make. So we'll say role seeder, again just keeping in line with the convention, and this will create a new seeder file that we're going to be adding some data in. Now in the database, you will notice that under the database folder we have we have the database migrations, and we have the seeds. So under seeds you will see that we have role seeder.php, and here we're going to define our data. So how do we define this? In our seeder, we're going to define the data that is going to be in our table. So we're going to have the data, and I'm going to have this as an array. Okay. Now this array, because we want to have multiple data, so we want to have the first entity. So here we'll have 3 roles: admin, user, other, right? So each of these roles will be a row by itself in the table. So we will have another array. So I'm going to have another array, and I'll have here the role name. Remember, the role ID was auto-incremented. So role name is going to be admin. Role name is going to be admin. It's always good to have them in lowercase, comma. We have the role description. Yeah, so again, I'm just going to have the role name, admin, role description as administrator. Remember the default status was 0, so all of them is are going to be 0. So here we can say the default role for administrator. Here we can say the default role for users and the default role for other. So just to confirm that we have the right 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So admin, user, other. So we have the right roles. Then we're going to simply add a command, because remember we are inserting into the database, so we'll use the db. So Codeigniter gives you a scaffolding for, or basically a function that you can use for the database. So the db, which you can use the insert. So insert allows you to insert one entry. We want to create this inside the table. So for the insert the table, we're going to add in the table roles, and we want to insert a batch of data. Remember, this is 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows. So this is a batch of data. So if it was only one, if you had defined 1 row, then we'd have if you only have 1 row, then you'll have something like this, where this now becomes the data inside it, and therefore you will use so that will become the array, and therefore you would use the insert. But because we have a nested array, then you'd use insert batch. All right, so once you have that, you confirm every data is correct, then you go back to the command and say php spark. Then you will notice that on a database you have db seed, so you'll say db seed, and you will give the name of the seeder. So you'll say role seeder, and this should essentially run that command line and give you some data. So if you refresh your data, not in migrations but in TBL roles, you should see that we have admin, user, other, and the default role, the data that you kept in. So this is how you are able to use seeders, and you're able to use migrations in setting up your data. So you can do the same for multiple tables, so user table, product table, any table that you're working with. You can create a default user by having seeders and the like, and you can expand it by having different functions as you please. So this was just an introduction to seeders. I hope this was informative. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you enjoyed the content and want to see more, please subscribe and share with your friends. Till next time, see you. Bye bye.